everyone. This is Mayor Lionel Jordan bringing you another segment of the Mayor's Corner. Today I have Alderman Matthew Petty from Ward 2, Position 2. We're going to interview Matt, talk a little bit about how he got into office and what he's working on and where he's going. And it's great to have you here today, Matt. And so
it's great to be here.
We go back about 5 years when I was running for this office the first time, and we've worked together on council that long. And Matt, you've been really great to work with, and
thank you.
And I've enjoyed our time together, and it looks like we'll have a few more years together. So
certainly hope so.
So why don't you tell folks how you got involved becoming an alderman, and what your vision is for your ward, and just take it away.
Sure. Well, you know, when I was growing up, I didn't really care much about politics, and then I moved to Fayetteville, and it's still a few years before I really cared very much about politics, but I just started noticing things around me because I walked around the city a lot. I still walk around the city a lot, and when you walk around a place, you notice a lot more than when you're just trying to get from point A to point B. And I started noticing the people, and I started noticing the surroundings, and I started thinking about how things might be able to be a little bit better. Not that they were bad. I think we have it very good in Fayetteville, but I just started to notice on those walks certain things that could be improved. And at the same time I was doing this, I was kind of going through some other changes. I kind of had an environmental epiphany, and I spent a few summers as a guide for the Boy Scouts doing backpacking and canoeing, and started realizing how important the environment was and how much we could get from it. And so I kind of came to politics from those two angles, seeing what could be done better in the city and having a deep respect for this place that we live in. And I started a nonprofit to do sustainability education and advocacy. And I got kind of frustrated with how long it took government to recognize some of the things that were important to me. And so at that point I just decided, well, maybe I should give it a shot and try to be in government where I can help make the decisions. And so that's how I got started in it.
Well, I know that you have been a strong proponent of the new urbanism. And I know that some of the things that you brought forward, I've learned a lot by watching your positions on new urbanism, and I've gained considerable knowledge by some of the things that you brought forward to the council, and I certainly want to thank you for that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about new urbanism this morning.
Sure. Well, I guess to start, new urbanism is kind of a funny phrase because it's really old urbanism, and I guess they put that word "new" on it just to make it.
You're right.
Just to make it glitzy, to catch people's attention. But it's really just the way we used to do things. And you know, if you look at some of the oldest neighborhoods in Fayetteville, that is, you know, new urbanism through and through. And what we're really talking about with new urbanism is going back to the old way of doing things, which was making cities great places to live in, where people wanted to live, where people wanted to move to. And I think it's important for a couple of different reasons. I guess I'll talk about the environmental side first, since
Sure,
that
absolutely.
goes to the first question you asked me. Take, for example, walkability. Well, if you crunch the numbers on walkability, living in a walkable neighborhood, living in a neighborhood where you can walk to work or walk to some of the other places you're going, that'll save you as much carbon dioxide emissions in a week as somebody else changing their light bulbs for an entire year. So the importance of that really can't be understated, but it really goes beyond the environment. It's about making places good places to live. You know, if a city is a good place to live in and people want to live there, then they won't try to go out and develop the woods and the agricultural fields around the city because they want to live in the city. But more than that, it really does come back to just making it a good place for people to live. Take seniors, for instance. I'm probably the youngest person to ever come on your show and talk about senior issues, but you can talk about new urbanism that way because when you're getting older and it's becoming harder to walk or harder to drive, suddenly everything that's available to you within a block or two of your home becomes a lot more important to you. If you can walk down to the store to get a gallon of milk without having to have your grandson or granddaughter come and drive you to the grocery store, that means a lot for your personal freedom. And so you can really come to new urbanism from a lot of different angles. And I almost don't like that word, new urbanism, just because it makes it seem so new. And really what we're talking about is just making communities as good as they used to be, making it so that it's natural to interact with somebody. Right now, with the kind of way we've seen towns grow over the last 50 years, and Fayetteville is no exception, you live in a neighborhood where you have to get in your car to do things. So that means you have to go out of your way to meet your neighbors. It doesn't happen naturally. You have to go out of your way. You have to make plans just to see people. And that's the opposite of way communities have grown for the last millennia. That's what new urbanism is about, getting back to that.
And I think that brings up an interesting word. When we look at the word like when it says restore, that means to restore it back to its original place. When we see the word return, that means you turn and return back to your original spot. When we see the word renew, that basically means to make new again the way it used to be.
Exactly.
So that's sort of what you're saying, is that it's not that you're making it new, but you're bringing it back to what it used to be. So you're renewing that and to its old way.
That's exactly right. And there are a lot of things that cities like Fayetteville can do to change our laws to make that more possible. If you look back to the way towns used to grow, they grew very organically. They didn't require public debt to do things. They didn't even require banks to do things because the activity that was already in place supported the growth. And when you look at neighborhoods today, that's not the way it is. Neighborhoods, you can only build a certain kind of neighborhood in today's world because of the laws that we have in place in the city and because of what the banks are willing to finance. And people who want to build places, people who want to build neighborhoods or homes or mixed-use developments, they have to operate in that real tiny bubble that they're constrained by us on this side and by the banks on the other side. And so really what it comes down to is if you want to build something the way things used to be, chances are it's either illegal in the community that you want to work in. And a lot of this is true in Fayetteville as well. Not totally, we've taken some important steps. Or you're forced by the banks to build something that's very conventional. And so what we see is a lot of conventional neighborhoods with houses on big lots with big footprints going out on the edge of town because that's all people are able to get done because of the rules that are in place. And so that's what we need to change. There's this new idea brewing called pink codes, which just means light red tape. It just means letting people be able to do what the market will already support, which means a lot of times smaller homes on smaller lots. It means being able to build one thing at a time instead of being forced by the rules to build a big development just to make the numbers pencil out. And if we can make those kinds of things happen over the next few years, I think we'll see a continuation of the trends that we've seen today. Not just apartment complexes, because I think we might have enough of those at this point, but seeing the old kinds of housing come back and the old kinds of corner stores come back if we could let that happen.
Renew to make new again to its original position. I like that. Let's talk about walkability. Now,
Sure.
We're making plans to triple sidewalk productions in the next 3 years. We're going from 12,000 running feet a year to 36,000 running feet a year. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a great first step. That's more than we've ever done before, and I think we need to celebrate that. But we shouldn't celebrate for too long. And the reason is, I think the discussion about whether any sidewalk is better than no sidewalk is settled in Fayetteville, and that's reflected by building 3 times as many more sidewalk feet this year than ever before. I think that debate is at least a decade old here, if not older.
Oh, absolutely.
And we've won it. But the next conversation has to be about what kind of sidewalks do we want to build? Because to get people walking, it's not enough to have a sidewalk. A sidewalk has to be safe and comfortable and useful and interesting. It has to satisfy all 4 of those requirements for people to really get out there and walk. If you don't satisfy those requirements, you either only get walkers of necessity, the poor folk who don't have any other means of getting to where they're going. They'll use a sidewalk that isn't safe. They'll use a sidewalk that isn't comfortable or that is uninteresting. Or die-hard walkers. But you're not really capturing the majority of the population. 90% of the population of our citizens won't get out there and use a sidewalk unless it satisfies all 4 of those conditions. So it's not just about building sidewalks. It's also about what are the zoning rules for the land next to the sidewalks? And what are the obstacles within the sidewalk? What is next to the sidewalk? Are there things there that will propel a walker from one end of the block to the other because there's just something just in their line of sight that they think is interesting enough to see? Or is there more than just a row of houses? Is there a corner store? Is there a useful reason for them to use that sidewalk? And that's how we really start to address walkability. We have to address all four of those dimensions.
I would certainly agree with that, because some of the things that I wanted to, or what I hope that we will promote in the city is, as we do these sidewalks, that children that walk to school, that we have safe routes for those children to be able to walk to school. If somebody wants to walk to the grocery store, that is convenient to their housing addition to be able to walk to that store and walk back.
Right.
If we take public transportation, that there would be certain stops, and then they could get off the bus and walk to wherever they wanted to go. And I really believe that, and we're just getting started on this. We're going to go from 12,000 to 36,000 feet a year, so we're going to be doing well over 100,000 feet in the next 3 years, which is probably the most I've seen in a 4-year stretch like that.
It's almost 20 miles.
Yes, and then you know, we're going to start with those schools, and then we're going to do well, you're familiar also. You're the chair of the street committee, so you've seen what we're looking at, and hopefully that the street committee will weigh in and make recommendations on how these need to be done. And I think you bring up some really good points on that. I certainly welcome that.
Well, you know, and that's the right approach to take too, is to focus on areas that would already support as many walkers as possible. And I want to say something about this, but before I do, you know, if I were to say this without this preface, I think a lot of people would think that I was anti-car. But we know that one way to kill a town, especially a downtown, is to prioritize cars and parking over everything else. And the only quicker way to kill a downtown is to get rid of all the cars. That's like saying the cure for obesity is to stop eating. And that's not the right approach to cars. That's not the right approach to transportation. We need to just change the diet so that other diets are possible, so that walking or riding a bike or taking transit is possible. So I want to say that first, because what I think we need to do is, we've got the right approach with building a lot of these sidewalks and focusing them around the schools. And what we need to do next is to figure out exactly what those sidewalks need to look like and what those neighborhoods around them need to look like. And we're having this conversation now at the street committee, now the transportation committee, so that we can talk about more than just cars. We're having this conversation now about Rupal Road, which has been a signature issue for you, where we have 3 schools on that corridor that we're talking about, and it's the most expensive road project that the city's ever undertaken. And it needs to be done. That connection needs to be made. But we need to make sure that we prioritize safety and cost over traffic volume and traffic speed.
I agree.
And we can do that there because the land is open right now and the landowners are eager to see a road in there. We have an opportunity to be able to plan what that land is going to turn into, so that it's not just the lowest common denominator land development, so that it's not just the cheapest solution that can get built the quickest.
Totally agree. Same thing with Van Ash. That Van Ash is coming up before even Rupal, and that is also going to be a connection.
Right. And you know, we talk about walkability, and it's important to draw these connections because really, I think if you want to measure the success of a community, it can all go back to walkability. You can tie almost any of the things that we talk about in the city, especially when it comes to tax revenues, back to walkability. You know, Van Ash is probably considered one of the biggest economic development potentials for the city going forward. And if we're going to make that work, though, we have to make sure that it's going to be able to pay for the services that it provides.
Absolutely.
And, you know, so we provide police and fire and water and sewer, all these services the city has to provide whenever we allow land to be developed. Well, all those comes with a cost, and it's paid for with property taxes and sales taxes, right? But if you just develop single-family homes, it turns out it won't pay for the maintenance of the roads and the maintenance of all those services. And so you get the growth and you get the taxes, and you're free and clear for 25 years until you have to replace a sewer line or replace the road. And then you see that what you allowed to get built ended up being almost a pyramid scheme because you go back into the red. But if you can make the right development happen, and you can look at it with a 25-year horizon instead of a 10-year horizon, then you can make sure that those things can get paid for year after year.
Oh, I agree, and I think it's not whether a city's going to develop and grow, but how do you grow the city? How do you develop the city? What kind of mixed use do you put together along a stretch of road? And I think it's a fascinating time to be in government, because we're really starting to move the city to another level and to take it places it's probably not been.
That's right.
Before.
And you highlighted exactly why all that goes back to walkability, because if you have a strip of big box stores with huge parking lots in the front, it turns out that won't pay for the services and it's not walkable. But if you have those same stores brought to the front of the street in a walkable environment, turns out you can fit more onto the same amount of space and you can pay for the services for the exact same tenants.
That's right.
And that's what we're talking about, I think, the next stage of Fayetteville. And it goes to neighborhoods too. Do you mind if I look at some
go
notes?
ahead.
I'm reading this book now. It's called Reshaping Metropolitan America. And the author who's Arthur Nelson, he looks at these studies by the National Association of Realtors about the size of housing and how housing stock today compares to what people actually want. And if you look at what we have today, we have our housing supply is about 50% conventional housing. So that means large homes on large lots. And about a third attached housing, so that's townhomes or apartments, things that share walls. And about 20% small houses on small lots. So that's kind of the historic old way of doing things, right? So that's what we have today. But if you look at what people actually want in surveys by groups like the National Association of Realtors, we have double the amount of big houses on big lots available compared to what people want, which is why they aren't selling. But we only have, we have 10 percentage points less of attached housing compared to what people want, which is why the prices of living downtown are pricing people out from living downtown. That's why our workers, like at the city, aren't able to live downtown close to where they work, is because the prices are too high, and the prices are too high because we don't have enough options down there. We have 9 percentage points difference. And it's similar for small homes on small lots. That's what most people want. Most people, like me, want to live in a house. You know, I don't want to live in an apartment. I don't want to live in a high-rise. I want to live in a house. But I don't want to live in a big house. I just want to live in a house that's big enough for me and that's close to the things that I like to do. Well, we're missing 20% of those kinds of homes compared to what people want. And I don't know exactly why we're missing it. I think it goes back to the banks haven't been willing to fund those sorts of things. And, you know, for a long time, our codes didn't allow a lot of that kind of stuff.
I think that's a great point, because I read the same book.
I know you have about 30 Post-it notes in there.
And, you know, one of the things that I noticed is some folks, they like living in an apartment. Some folks like a smaller house. But what I'm seeing for by and large is smaller homes on smaller lots.
That's what most people want.
That's what I'm seeing right now. But I also in the same book, he talks about another generation coming on that really wants more of the apartment style living and being able to walk to stores close through the apartment complex too. But that's, you know, there's different generations of folks that have different perspectives.
That's exactly right. And if you drill in those numbers, you know, a lot of people, even in the new urbanist movement, a lot of people have said for a long time that my generation, the millennials, they only want to live downtown. And that turns out not to be true. About half of us want to live the way we've grown up living. But the other half, they're willing to trade down to a small lot if it means they get to walk to something. And they're willing to trade down to an apartment if it means they get to walk to more things. And we see the same thing happening, by the way, with the boomers. As they become empty nesters or widowers, they want to size down. And this is going to be a real problem in the future if we don't get ahead of it. People talk about aging in place, how most people want to age in place. They want to continue to live in the neighborhood that they've lived in, that they raised their kids in, because they have friends there, because they know the people there. And just for all those social reasons. But if you look at what's happening with housing prices and with the cost of living and the cost of transportation, a lot of those folks aren't going to be able to age in place. They're not going to be able to afford to do that. But the tragedy is that they're also not going to be able to afford to move somewhere else because their homes are underwater and because the costs of moving have gone up. And so they're going to be forced to age in place. And the only way to get ahead of this is to identify that problem right away and make sure that we have those other housing options available for them and that we have those at the right supply level so that they're not too expensive. Because right now, remember, those homes, we don't have enough of them to meet the supply, and that's why they're more expensive and most people can't live in them.
That's a great point. Let's shift gears a little bit here.
Sure.
I know that one of the things I'm very interested in is water trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we're looking at doing water trafficking up the Arkansas River, and we know that for every barge that we float up the Arkansas River, if the choke points are removed, that it's the same equivalent of 80 large trucks on the road, which is something that I've been very interested in for a while, because your water traffic is the cheapest way to move supplies, and it drops the price on housing, materials, so the business cost goes down, creates jobs in the area, and that's something I'm very interested in. What thoughts do you have on water trafficking, and I know it cuts back also on CO2 emissions.
Sure. I think it's a good idea. I think it's part of a big picture transportation solution, and we have to take that big picture approach. You know, the logistics and transportation companies in Northwest Arkansas are the biggest transportation companies in the world. And they've moved over the last 20 years from just being trucking companies to being intermodal transportation companies. And I think if they had the means to use barges, that they would do that. But they don't even have the means to do that right now. So I think that's a good idea. You know, they also don't have the means to use rail right now very much at all. We have a freight line through Northwest Arkansas, but we only have one, and it's got some pretty stiff terrain, the Boston Mountains, and so it's a little bit limited what kind of capacity that they're able to use on that line. And so I think that being able to float barges up the river, it's a good part of that big picture transportation.
One of the things that in some of the studies that what got me interested in is because I began to look at the skyrocketing prices of diesel and gas and that sort of thing. And we know from the studies that I've looked at that you can move supplies by barge for about 15 cents a mile. Mm-hmm. And then rail is about 37 cents a mile. The truckers could actually hook up in Fort Smith in that area and do a short haul, or they can actually float the trucks on the barge, and that's some of the things we're looking at. So that's going to be, I think, the future of this region, is that type of transportation, and also cuts down on wear and tear on your highways. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to replace the highways as much, and you don't have to build as big of roads. So
you know, that's exactly right. And you know, long haul trucking is really, people forget, long haul trucking is a very modern invention. It's really in the last 20 or 30 years, if that long, that long haul trucking has really been the way to move supplies around the country. Always before, you did it on freight and you did it in the water, and then you did the last mile in the trucks. And I think we're going to see a return to that somewhat. You know, and I'm excited to see that. And I think it's useful too to talk about, since we're talking about supply chains in a broader context, you know, if you look at 100 years, I think a lot of these supply chains are going to start to break down even further. And so they're not going to go away. Transportation is still going to be important, but I think we're going to see a lot more of our goods and services provided locally. And figuring out how to make our community resilient, how to restore it to the old way of doing things, it's probably the most important challenge we have to face. And, you know, on that kind of horizon, that century-long horizon, I'm not going to be around to see that. And my daughter will be your age by the time we see that future. But I think that's the only future we've got left, is to figure out how to make sure more of those goods and services can be provided locally. And, you know, like you said, cuts down on the wear and tear of our highways. Well, I think trucks get subsidized about 30 cents for every dollar of highway construction, so that they don't quite pay their way. It turns out most of the other passenger vehicles actually pay for that highway construction for the trucking industry. And so figuring out a way to keep more of those dollars in our community means keeping more of the goods and services, more of the production in our community too.
Oh, I agree. Another topic I want to talk about today that you were point on a grant that we just received in the city. And maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's good that we're doing this today. We're filming July 17th, so today was the day that we're allowed to talk about it from the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm really excited about this. We got $100,000 to design a new street for School Avenue, along with putting some public art there. And so this is a section of School Avenue between the library and the Walton Arts Center. And if you just imagine in your head what downtown looks like, the Walton Arts Center and the library are kind of cornerstones for all of downtown. You know, you've got those two corners, and then you've got the square is the other corner, and the fourth corner hadn't really been penciled out yet, but it's there somewhere. But the public library and the Walton Arts Center are two of the most important pieces for our downtown, for the enjoyment of it. They help prop up everything else that goes on. But if you walk the street between them, it's fascinating because they're so important, and we put so much money as a community, not just as a government, as a community, into those two institutions. There's not a good sidewalk in between the two. It's not even ADA compliant. And it's really disappointing that it's not ADA compliant because it's not just the library and the Walton Arts Center that are there, it's also Hillcrest Towers, which is our largest public housing facility. It's 120 apartments for the elderly and the disabled. And if you think about where do we need an ADA compliant sidewalk anywhere in town, if we're going to only have one, it's got to be next to that place. But we don't have one yet. And so that's what this grant is meant to do. It's meant to create a new street there that will address that need for those residents and the visitors to the area. And by the way, if you add the visitors for the Walton Arts Center to the visitors from the library, there's more than 500,000 people go to that area of town every year just to enjoy those two places. So this is one of the most important areas in town to focus our attention, especially because it's not just the fact that those institutions are there, but it's about 60% grass or parking lot, which means it could support a lot more than was there if people were walking between those two spots. And so that's what this is meant to do. And going back to, you have to have a sidewalk that's not just safe, it's not just there, it has to be safe, comfortable, useful, and interesting. That's what this is meant to do with the public art, is to make it interesting to give people to take that route between those places. And so we've got $100,000 with $100,000 worth of match. The University of Arkansas Community Design Center, which is internationally recognized for their designs all over the country, even having designs in Rwanda. They just got recognized for their designs in Little Rock in their downtown. To be able to work with them on this, I think, is phenomenal, and they're putting up about $35,000 of their time towards it. And then the Walton Arts Center as well, with their Artisphere budget that comes from the Walton Family Foundation, they're going to put $40,000 at least towards the art. So we've got no money coming from the city except for just a little bit of staff time, about $5,000 worth of staff time, and we're going to get almost $200,000 worth of services out of it. So I think this is phenomenal. It's going to do great things for downtown. The next conversation we need to have after the design is done is how do we build the design? And I think that's a conversation for next year when the design is done, talking about how we can dedicate some money to actually building the designs that come out. But we're going to be very close to having that finished, because with this grant, we're going to get all of the design and almost all of the engineering taken care of. And so that's at least a third of the total construction costs if we were to go forward with the project that's already funded.
Okay. Well, next term, some of your goals.
Oh,
Give me 2 or 3 or 4 or...
Well, you know, I ran on a platform that was fairly ambitious, and that talked about doing a lot of these things that we've already talked about. The next thing on my agenda, I think we're going to get rolling on this next month at the council. We're in very final review, and I'm collecting letters of support now, is supporting mobile vendors, supporting food trucks. Food trucks are, they're all the rage all over the nation, everywhere. It's being called the next culinary revolution. And there are even, TV shows, reality shows about food trucks now because they're so popular. And people in Fayetteville, entrepreneurs, are chomping at the bit to get food trucks, to start food trucks here in town. But our laws are written for farm stands. So we've figured out a way to shoehorn in the food trucks and the food trailers you see around town into that old law. But it's keeping a lot of people that have the money and that have the drive from starting their own business, because right now we can only give them a permit for 90 days guaranteed, and then after that it's up to the planning commission. So they don't have any guarantee they can even be in business all year long. And so that's what we need to fix, and that's what we're going to talk about doing in a month. So that's my next thing. And then beyond that, I'm not sure what the next piece is, but when I just got back from Salt Lake a couple months ago, I went to a Congress for the new Urbanism to see what it was all about, and I've never learned so much from any kind of educational event. Good. And learning how important walkability is, and learning how to talk about it, and learning the ways we can change the laws to support it. I don't know exactly what those proposals are going to look like now, but that's what I'm spending all my time thinking about, is how can we make this town more walkable, because that's where you get your tax revenues, that's where you get your social support. Let me explain. Do we have enough time to explain this real quick? Yeah. If you look at property taxes in Fayetteville over the last 30 years, let's do 40 years, back to the 70s, and you take the level we were collecting in 1970 over the entire community, and then you look at today what we're collecting over the entire city, and you adjust that for inflation. So in real terms, in 1970s dollars, we're collecting less property taxes now per acre of land in the city than we were back then. I don't know why. That seems the exact opposite of how you want your community to grow. You should at least hold that steady. And so in essence, we've been committing property tax suicide for the last 40 years. And the way to fix that is to make sure all these places are walkable, to make sure you can get this compact mixed-use development that collects higher revenues and allows more things to take place for the same amount of land. Now, social situations, when you look at a walkable neighborhood, the research shows people who live in a walkable neighborhood are more civically engaged. They know who their politicians are. They know what their government is doing. They talk to their neighbors about it. And it makes sense when you think about in a walkable neighborhood, you run into your neighbors just by virtue of living there, and when you run into them, you talk about what's going on. So you just naturally, through the course of living in these kinds of places, you become more civically engaged. And so it makes a lot of sense from these perspectives to focus on that. And I learned how to talk about it at that conference. So that's my next big thing. That's probably all I'm going to focus on for the next 3 years, every way I can, for those reasons. And like I said earlier, you live in a walkable neighborhood, you save as much carbon emissions in a week as somebody changing their light bulb saves in a year. So it makes a lot of sense from all those points.
I know something else that you and I will be working on probably this year is a urban agri ordinance.
Yes.
So maybe you'd like to talk to folks a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, now, I don't know if your life was like this, but my life was like this, where every day when I was growing up in my home, we made sure to sit down for at least one meal together. And that was what kept our family together.
Absolutely.
In a real fundamental way. And since I've moved away, since I've lived on my own, and I think about some of the most important memories to me is sharing a meal with friends. And they say your family or your friends are the family you choose. So I like to think of sharing meals with my friends as sharing a meal with my chosen family. And that's probably, my most important memories. And I think if you look at the community, we can see some parallels there. For instance, if you add up jobs, we have more jobs in the food sector than we have in any other sector. When you add up the people serving food, the people cooking food, the people stocking shelves, and the farmers, you don't even have to add the farmers if you want to talk about Washington County, But if you just want to talk about the city, we've still got more people in the food industry than we have in any other sector. So food is already a lot more important to the city than people realize. Now with this ordinance we're talking about with urban agriculture, first I think it's just a start. Figuring out how to do urban agriculture in a real integrated way is a big challenge for modern communities. It used to be the ways of doing things, but it's hard to get back to that just because cities do so much more now. We do so many more different things.
So we have to renew that again.
Yeah, we have to figure out how to renew it and not get rid of the good things
That's
that are
right.
modern too.
And come back to a lot of the old ways we used to do things.
Right, and if you look at some people in this who are talking a lot about urban agriculture, and I agree with them, say that most cities are only 3 days away from anarchy. And they say that because most grocery stores only stock 3 days worth of food. And there's no other place to get food. And so when the grocery stores run out of food for some event, what happens? It's a true emergency. And a lot of people don't realize, because government doesn't have a whole lot to do with it at the local level, just how important food is to keeping the community running. And so when we look to the future, it's not really that out of line to imagine a scenario where our food supply becomes challenged. Maybe fuel prices go up so that people, even middle-class people, are priced out of getting food, let alone healthy food. And so it's an equity issue, but it's also just a straight resilience issue because our city can't function without food. And so we have to find a way to protect ourselves against those kinds of events. One thing that I think is really exciting, the U of A Community Design Center, which we just talked about, is in the middle of a scenario plan for Fayetteville. Well, they're asking the question, what would Fayetteville look like in 2030 if it could grow all the food it needed inside the city limits? And it's a fascinating question. And the project is meant to only answer that question, so it's not going to give us something that we can implement exactly, but what it is going to do is it's going to give us some tools that we can use to start to address that question. And it turns out, if that was all we were willing to do, we could grow all the food that we needed within our city limits, but the town would look a lot different. But I think if you can take some of those ideas and implement even just a few of them, if we could just grow 20% of the food we needed within the city limits, that means that if we had an event like that in the future where our food supply was challenged or our food costs went way up, we'd be protected against it. It wouldn't be such a grave emergency from us. It wouldn't bankrupt us. So that's kind of the economic piece. But to be honest, I think that's a little bit boring. What I'm more concerned about is the social piece, because today, Washington County has the highest rate of child hunger in the state. And that's one of the highest in the nation. Because Arkansas doesn't rank that good, doesn't rank that high whenever it comes to making sure its kids aren't hungry. Which is sad because we're also one of the biggest agricultural exporters in the nation too. So I don't quite see why that math makes sense to some of our higher up elected leaders, and that's something we need to talk to them about. But given what's going on in Washington County today, what that means is there are folks today who have to choose between keeping the heat on over the winter or providing food to their kids. That's what that means. And that's heartbreaking. There's hundreds of families in Fayetteville being one of the most affluent communities in the state, that have to make that choice every winter. And I can't imagine that. I live in a situation where my life is so luxurious where I get to complain whenever Ozark Natural Foods stops carrying my favorite kind of cheese. And those people are choosing between keeping the heat on and buying a loaf of bread. And the only way to fix that is to help them be able to grow some of their own food. And that means helping everybody in the community being able to grow some of their own food.
I totally agree. We know that in the course of a day, 18,000 children will die of starvation in the world. Mm-hmm. We also know that if we grow our own foods, not only does it support the people as a whole, but it also helps the people that are trying to learn how to garden. And there could be a time where those skills of gardening, and I'm a big proponent of teaching gardening and teaching people how to grow their own food, because a lot of that has been lost over the centuries because it's been so easy to go down to the grocery store. But I totally agree with you. And one of the things that got me interested in this is when we had the ice storm a few years ago, everything on the shelves was gone within just a matter of no time. And I suddenly realized that if we had a large natural disaster in this city, that the ability to grow food would be paramount, and learn how to store our own food and grow our own food. So it's important to the city that we know those skills. And I think that we need to provide the type of ordinance that allows people to grow their own gardens, grow their own food. And it's important. And I appreciate your work on that.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think that, well, I guess yes. I think that, in Fayetteville, we're on a good track. And I always try to talk about this at least once, because there's so many people in the community that still think this way. People try to compare us to some of our neighbors here in Northwest Arkansas. And if they care about how friendly we are to business, or if they care about what's happening with the art scene, or they care about jobs or something else, they always still try to compare us to some of our neighbors, like Fayetteville versus Bentonville, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what people need to realize in Fayetteville is, A, we're on the right track, but more than that, we have the assets we need to make this a 21st century city. And not just a 21st century, like glitz and glam, the kind of thing you'd see in Popular Mechanics in the 50s. We're talking about a 21st century that is right for the people who live here, that is sustainable for us, that is socially sustainable, that is economically sustainable, people can earn a living wage. And the reason we have these assets, and the reason why I think that comparison doesn't make sense is, look, we've got twice as many people as any other community in Northwest Arkansas. We've got an institution here, the University of Arkansas, which does more for us and than any other institution in any other city does for them. That stuff's not going to go away. And, ever since Northwest Arkansas Fayetteville has been the de facto cultural hub of Northwest Arkansas, the de facto economic hub of Northwest Arkansas. And it's okay for that to change a little bit. It's okay for there to be another place to go. It's okay for there to be more than one place to enjoy in a region. And what we need to remember is that doesn't keep us from being unique. We're still unique. We're still Fayetteville. We're still our own thing. And to make us a 21st century, we need to remember what it is we have and build on those things, and not worry about trying to chase every kind of thing the other communities are doing. Let them be their own thing, and we'll be our own thing.
I totally agree, Matthew. I believe that this city is unique in what it is and what it stands for, and what it's always made it Fayetteville. That's right. And so, but I want to thank you for being on the show today. It's been wonderful sharing your thoughts today. And
I love it.
And this Matthew Petty, Alderman from Ward 2, Position 2, and this is some of the fine city council that I have the privilege and honor of working with as a mayor. And as a close today, I want to say something to the people. There's two types of government you can have. You can have a consumer-based government that says, what's in it for me? What do I get out of it? It's all about me. But what we're establishing, and I believe have already established, is a partnership-based government where every citizen in this city is a part owner, and that everybody's ideas are important. We believe in 3 guiding principles: open door, open mind, and open heart. And we open the doors to everyone, and we believe that everyone should have the freedom of expression, and we serve rather than being served. And once we get a handle on those principles and we realize it's a partnership-based government, we will take this city further than it's ever been before. So until I see you again, you have a great day, and I'll see you real soon.